Hello, class. Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the diversity of life on Earth. So we've covered evolution, how life evolved, went from that very first life, and radiated out into all of the diversity that we see today. And today we're going to cover some of that diversity. So it's going to be um, really quick because we're going to look at almost all the life on Earth in just a few lectures. We're going to cover it. But we're going to start with microbes, and then we are going to talk about um, so those are the prokaryotes, and then we're going to move right into eukaryotes, and we're going to talk about protists, and we're going to talk about plants and fungi, and we'll get to animals in a little bit as well. All right, so let's get started. These are chapters 13 and 14 in your text. Okay, so as it says, this is a super quick overview. Nothing slow about it. All right, so first we will talk about prokaryotes, and then we'll get into eukaryotes. So here is just a tree of life. So we've talked a little bit about phylogenies, and you've done a phylogeny lab. Of all life on Earth. So you can see, here the bacteria and archaea are both prokaryotes. Which means these are single-celled organisms with no nucleus. Their DNA is in a circle. Eukaryotes branched off of the archaea. We're a little more closely related to the archaea than we are to bacteria. And in the eukaryotes, so those are, if you remember our Linnaean system, right, it goes domain, and that's either eukaryote or prokaryote, and then it goes kingdom. So within the eukaryote domain, we have 4 kingdoms. So we have plants, animals, fungi, and protists. And those are the ones that we are going to talk about now. Well, actually, we're going to talk about prokaryotes first. So the very, very first life on Earth was a prokaryote. It was most likely anaerobic, meaning that it did not use oxygen, and was probably an extremophile, meaning it lived in some sort of extreme environment. Right, so very hot, very cold, very salty, very acidic, something like that. So not the atmosphere that we know of today. And that's why when we talked about the Urey Miller experiment, right, he had a different atmosphere they had a different atmosphere that they were assuming the planet had. Some of those very early organisms may have been phototrophs, and those are the ones that eventually began oxygenating the atmosphere later on. So there are, as we learned very early in the semester with our theory of endosymbiosis, and we'll briefly remind you again in a few slides, there are photosynthetic bacteria. So, and those are called cyanobacteria. They're also called blue-green algae, but they're not algae, they're bacteria. So the name it's a bad name. So you can, but if you hear that term, it's not an algae at all. Okay, so both archaea and bacteria are prokaryotes. Everyone's heard of bacteria. Archaea are less well known, and they really, for our extensive purposes, they really just differ in some of their structure and the components of their cell wall. So it's not. We don't need to focus on any other differences. Now, prokaryotes, though, they don't sexually reproduce, as you know, but that doesn't mean that they're all clones of one line. They can definitely move DNA around. So the 3 ways that they can share DNA are through transformation, which is where one cell will just be like, walking along and find DNA and take it up into its own cell. So this could be pathogenic DNA that it finds in its travels, or it could be just a few little ATs, Gs, and Cs. But this is how, something that is a DNA into it. Another way is through transduction, which is a virus taking DNA from one bacteria and then invading another bacteria and spreading that DNA. And through conjugation, where from one bacteria to another, they just set up a little trading program, and they transfer from one to another. So there can be gene flow even among different species of bacteria. Now, I don't want everyone to think that just because we're talking about harmful bacteria and we think about getting sick and resistance to antibiotics, not all bacteria are bad. So we eat a lot of food products that require bacteria, and those are actually often really good for us because they aid the microbes in our gut, right? So we need our gut microbes. And humans are using bacteria and doing more research into them to help us solve some of our problems. So they can digest some agricultural chemicals, they can clean oil spills, genetically engineered ones. They're doing some work into having them clean plastics, which are also often petroleum based as well. So plastic waste like in the ocean and things like that. So there's definitely a lot of potential for bacteria, and they also do some biomedical work, right? They make insulin. We can get them to produce some human enzymes and other medical products. So bacteria can be extremely helpful to us as well. Please ignore the crying in the background. My dog is very sad for no reason, so don't feel too bad for him. Okay, so how did bacteria, like and archaea, those first prokaryotes, how did eukaryotes evolve from them? And we talked about this. Hopefully, you remember this slide from way back in the beginning of the semester. This theory of endosymbiosis, right? So, there was infolding of that cell membrane, and that may have formed the nucleus and the endoplasmic reticulum, right? Some of the more membranous parts of eukaryotic cells. And then there was endosymbiosis, right? This like taking in and living together. So some bacteria may have come into or been engulfed by a larger cell, and that eventually became the mitochondria. It was an aerobic bacteria that was able to, process oxygen and make energy. And then here's another bacteria, a photosynthetic one, right, that got taken up by a larger cell and eventually became a chloroplast. So now we're going to talk about move on to the eukaryotes themselves. And we're going to start with protists, which are probably one of the least understood groups. And it's a total mishmash of organisms that are not necessarily closely related to each other. So it's very diverse. Most are aquatic organisms and are unicellular, which means just one cell, but there are some multicellular ones. So if you've seen kelp or eaten sushi, the seaweed, right, that is a multicellular protist. So all algae is, let me write in algae here. Algae is a protist, and it's big. It looks like a plant. It's not a plant. They're different. Many of them can move, but not all of them, right? Algae obviously are kind of stuck in the ground. They have something called a holdfast. That's kind of like roots that hold onto the surface of the bottom of the water. But the ones that can move have a variety of structures. So some have flagella, some have cilia, some have pseudopods. So that's like an amoeba, right? Just looks like that. And then they could make their body kind of move if they wanted to move down. This guy could kind of go like that, right? And kind of push all the cytoplasm down. So that's a single celled organism there. Some are autotrophs, meaning they eat other organisms, either other plant material. I'm sorry, autotrophs meaning they feed themselves, apologies, so they are photosynthetic. Others are heterotrophs, meaning they eat other things. So it might be they eat plants, or it might be they eat dead things. They could be decomposers, or they might eat other organisms, and kind of hunt other organisms. Some of them are pathogens, so these are ones that are more parasitic. So, like malaria is a pathogen that is passed by a mosquito, but the malaria itself is a protist. African sleeping sickness, Chagas disease. These are all, you've probably also heard of like amoebic dysentery, right? These are all protist diseases. But there are beneficial ones too, right? Obviously, we eat Some of them aid in decomposition. Obviously, photosynthesis is extremely important, and that's part of the carbon sink in the ocean. The algae, all of the photosynthetic protists absorb a lot of carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. Some protists also have a relationship with coral, so they are photosynthetic. They live inside the coral. They provide the coral with some nutrition, and the coral kind of provides them a safe place to live. When um, ocean conditions change, when it becomes too acidic or too warm, that's when the coral kind of kicks out the algae, and that's when you see coral bleaching, and the coral dies. So here's just an example of the broad range of different types of protists. So we have coral up to this is coral, which is a protist. We have algae, and then we have some single-celled organisms, paramecium. This is a diatom. Some of them have toxins that they emit that cause like red tides and things like that that you may have heard of. I forget what this one's called, but it has multiple flagella, as you can see. So there's a real diversity in their looks. Here's an amoeba. Looks like it's waving. So lots of different types of protists. All right, and now we're going to move on to fungi. Also, a really diverse group. It goes from single-celled organisms like yeast, everyone probably knows them, to mushrooms, which are these very, very large multicellular organisms. They're actually pretty closely related to animals, more closely related to animals than they are to plants. Most fungi are sessile, which means they don't move, and are multicellular decomposers, but obviously some are single celled. They do not have chlorophyll, so there are no photosynthetic fungi. Their cell walls are made of chitin, which is the same material that insect exoskeletons are made of. So that's another, shows a little bit more of the link between animals and fungi. Now, the way that fungi feed is they actually excrete enzymes that will decompose organic things around them, and then they kind of absorb that nutrient. So that can happen in the ground. If it's a mushroom, it may decompose things, like leaf matter and things like that. Some will decompose living things like plants around them. If any of you have ever had athlete's foot, that's a fungus, and it's kind of, doing that to your foot, which is why it's kind of painful. So some are parasites and some are decomposers, but they all feed in the same general way. And one cool thing is that the mycelium are the little fibers that make up what we would almost like in plants, what's the root of them. So when you are looking at a mushroom, it's kind of like if this were an apple tree, if the apples were the things that popped up out of the ground and the rest of the tree was underground. So the mushroom itself is a very bad picture of a mushroom, but the mushroom itself is a very small part of the organism. And then the mycelium are these fibers that run. And so they can go, 4 miles. And can be thousands of years old. So if you've ever like dug in your garden and you've seen little white strands and you didn't know what they were, that's actually mycelium of fungi. Now, some fungi are extremely beneficial. We eat them. They also fight bacteria just like we do. And so they produce antibiotics naturally. And so the very first antibiotic, penicillin, was discovered by accident. And it was, I think it was a bread mold. But it's a from a mold. It's a product made by the fungi. And many of our antibiotics have been discovered through fungi. Plants and fungi can have some close relationships. So, some fungi can have little parts that will invade the root of a plant, but rather than harming that plant, actually it takes some of the sugars from the roots, but it actually will give the plant some food sources as well, some phosphorus and nitrogen. So things that it has been able to extract that the plant needs, it will give them some of those minerals so that the plants are stronger. They can also have relationships with bacteria and algae. So anyone who's seen lichen growing, it looks like this, right, at the on a tree, or sometimes they grow on rocks. It's actually, it looks like one organism, but it's actually two. So it's a fungus and either an algae or a bacteria. So there are many different lichens out there. And they are it's so symbiotic that they really do grow together. You need a microscope to tell where they separate, like what you're looking at. The fungus itself, it is feeding from the sugars. It's either a photosynthetic algae or a photosynthetic bacteria, and that the photosynthetic partner gets water and nutrients again from the fungus, so it provides that. Okay, and I think we're going to stop here, and then we'll start up again to cover plants. So we have a lot to talk about with plants.